Dan opened his eyes and saw clay. Wet, cold, reddish. His cheek was pressed right against it. Rain pelted the back of his head in fine, angry drops. He tried to breathe and coughed. He rolled onto his back. The sky was gray and low. Not a single familiar landmark. Not a single sound of machinery. Not even the hum of ventilation. No clicks from the dosimeter. Silence. Just the rain and the wind in the grass. Dan sat up. His head was throbbing so hard that for a second he thought his skull had cracked. He ran his hand over his face. Blood from his nose. His fingers were intact. His legs were intact. His smart polymer jumpsuit was torn at the shoulder and on his right knee, but it was still holding together. The multi-tool was on his belt. The tablet was in his chest pocket. Dan pulled it out. The screen flickered. Half a charge left. No signal. No network. No satellites. Absolutely no satellites. He looked at the air quality indicator and froze. 0 particles. Absolute 0. No dust, no microplastics, no traces of combustion. Air like this hadn't existed on Earth since the beginning of the industrial era. Dan slowly lowered his tablet and looked around. A wide river below, a limestone cliff to the right, a forest stretching to the horizon. No roads, no utility poles, no clear cuts. He was sitting on a hillside in the middle of a world where there was not a single trace of human civilization. The stabilizer, the test. A white flash, 2 seconds into nothingness, and here he was. Dan stood up. His legs buckled. He took 3 steps toward the river and stopped because he saw a footprint. Huge, 5-toed, deeply imprinted in the wet clay. He crouched down and measured it with his palm. 30 centimeters long. Claws. The creature that left this footprint weighed at least 400 kilograms. A cave bear, or something even bigger. Dan straightened up and very slowly backed away from the river. His heart was pounding. He was an engineer. He designed arcologies for 200,000 people. He calculated loads on 100-meter-high walls. But now he stood alone in the middle of the wild, without a single tool except his multi-tool, and realized one very simple thing. He was prey. Dan moved along the cliff edge. He could take shelter from the rain under a rock overhang. He found a niche 200 meters away. It wasn't deep, about 3 meters deep, but it was dry. He climbed inside and sat down, his back pressed against the rock. He took out his multi-tool and opened the knife. The carbon steel blade glinted dimly. Against a bear, it was like a toothpick. Dan smirked. Back in his day, people built cities in the asteroid belt. And here he was, sitting in a rock hole, happy with a knife the length of a finger. He sat there until dusk. The rain hadn't let up. The temperature was dropping. His coveralls kept him warm, but not indefinitely. He needed a fire. Dan pulled out his multi-tool and clicked the lighter. A small blue tongue of flame lit up the walls of the niche. He found some dry grass under a ledge in the back. He piled it up. He placed wood chips, chipped off with the knife from a dry root sticking out of the wall, underneath. He lit it. The flame caught. Dan added twigs one by one. 10 minutes later, he had a small but steady fire. The smoke rose up toward a crack in the niche's ceiling. The draft was natural and almost perfect. Dan noted this automatically. Even here. Even now. His brain was working as usual. He saw the crack and calculated its cross-section. He saw the stone and assessed its compressive strength. He saw the clay on the floor and realized it was too wet for building, but in 3 days, after being exposed to the sun, it would be suitable. It was stronger than him. You can't turn off an engineer. Night fell quickly. The darkness outside the niche became absolute. Not a single lantern on the planet, not a single lamp, not a single window. Dan lay by the fire and listened. A howl. Distant. Then closer. Then right up close. Wolves, or something worse. Then a scream. Not animal, human. Short, cut off. Dan gripped his knife and didn't move. He's no hero. He's no warrior. He's an engineer. And he's lying in a stone crevice, listening to someone die in the darkness, and there's nothing he can do. Morning dawned gray and cold. Dan hadn't slept. The fire had burned down to embers. He made his way out. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the ragged clouds. He walked along the river and found them half an hour later. 8 people were standing at the edge of a rocky clearing in front of the entrance to a large cave. Skins draped over their shoulders, spears with flint points. Their faces were weather-beaten, dark and hard. A woman stood at the front. She was short and wiry. A charred bone stuck out of her tangled black hair. Her eyes were such that Dan stopped in his tracks. He had seen eyes like that only once in his life. The eyes of the rescue team leader after the Delta sector collapse, when 60 people died. The eyes of a man who had counted all the dead and kept working. The spears were raised. 8 spearheads were aimed at Dan. He was standing in the open. There was nowhere to run. Fighting was pointless. Dan slowly raised his hands and showed his empty palms. He looked at the woman with the bone in her hair and said in English the only thing that came to mind. "I'm not an enemy. I know how to build." No one understood a word. The spears didn't lower. One of the hunters stepped forward, young, broad-shouldered, a scar running across his entire left cheek. He jabbed his spear toward Dan and said something quickly and sharply. The others stirred. Dan saw their arms tense. One move, and the spear would pierce his throat. He didn't move. The woman with the bone in her hair raised her hand. Everyone fell silent. She looked at Dan for a long time. Then she looked at his overalls, at the multi-tool on his belt, at his hands, pale, slender, without a single hunter's callus. Hands that had never held a spear. She said one word, short, guttural. The spears were lowered. Not all the way, but they were lowered. The woman pointed to the ground at her feet. "Sit down." Dan understood the gesture and sat down, right on the wet rocks. The woman crouched down across from him and looked him in the eyes. Dan held her gaze. He wasn't afraid. He was just tired. So tired that his fear had vanished, leaving only a heavy, clear thought. If they kill him, that's the end. If not, he'll have to work. The woman must have seen something in his eyes. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe the absence of a threat. Maybe she simply decided that this skinny, pale stranger wasn't worth a spear. She stood up and nodded toward the cave. Dan got up and followed her. 8 spears followed behind him. He entered the cave and immediately began to cough. Smoke. Thick, bitter, suffocating smoke. A fire was burning right in the center of the cave. The smoke didn't rise upward but lay low against the ceiling, slowly creeping toward the exit. People sat down low on the ground, breathing in that smoke every day. Everyone's eyes were red and inflamed. The children were coughing. An old woman by the far wall was coughing non-stop. Dan looked at the hearth. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the entrance. And it clicked in his head. As always. Draft. That's the problem. The hearth is in the center. The smoke rises, but it has nowhere to go. The cave ceiling is smooth. They need a chimney, or at least a directed flow. Move the hearth toward the wall. Break through or widen the crack above it. Create a channel. That's a job that will take several hours. Dan looked at the woman with the bone in her hair. She was looking at him expectantly. He didn't know a single word of her language. But he was an engineer. And an engineer speaks with his hands. Dan stood up and walked over to the hearth. He pointed at the fire. He pointed at the smoke near the ceiling. He pointed at his throat and coughed. Then he pointed at the cave wall, at the crack above it. And he began to gesture with his hands. Fire here, smoke there, up, out. The woman watched. The hunters watched. No one understood. Dan sighed. All right. Not with words, with action. Dan didn't wait for permission. He walked over to the cave wall and began examining the crack above his head. Narrow, about 5 centimeters. But it went upward, and he could feel a faint draft. So there was a way out. He needed to widen it. He took out his multi-tool and extended the screwdriver. Then he looked at the crack and realized the screwdriver was useless. He needed a rock. Dan looked around. He picked up a flat flint fragment from the cave floor. He walked over to the crack and began chipping away, monotonously, methodically, piece by piece. The limestone crumbled. Not quickly, but it crumbled. The hunters stood and watched. The woman with a bone in her hair said something to the others. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She said something like, "Let him do it." He worked for 3 hours. His hands were rubbed raw and bleeding. The crack widened to 15 centimeters. Dan dragged the stones from the old hearth to the wall. He laid a new foundation. Flat stones at the bottom, walls on the sides to direct the heat upward. At the top, he left an open channel leading to the crack. He wasn't building a chimney, he was building a path, a way for the smoke to go. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at it. Rough, crooked. The stones didn't fit together perfectly, but the principle was right. Dan lit a fire in the new spot. The flames caught, the smoke rose. It hit the walls, it swirled, and it drifted into the crack. Slowly, hesitantly, but it drifted. 10 minutes later, there was noticeably less smoke near the ceiling. Half an hour later, the air in the cave felt different. The old woman by the far wall stopped coughing. She raised her head and looked at the cave entrance, then at the hearth, then at Dan. The children ran up to the new fire and held out their hands. The warmth was coming straight at them, not up into nowhere, right at them. One of the hunters stepped closer, the one with the scar. He bent down and looked at the masonry. He touched the stones. He looked at the crack where the smoke was escaping. Then he looked at Dan. He didn't say anything, but he didn't raise his spear. The woman with the bone in her hair was the last to approach. She stood next to the new hearth for a long time. Dan could see her breathing, deeply and slowly, like someone who, for the first time in a long while, could breathe normally. She looked at Dan and spoke a word. Just one. He didn't understand it, but he remembered the sound. It was his first word in their language. Later he would learn that it meant fire. That night, they gave him a place by the wall, a hide on the floor, a piece of tough, dried meat. Dan chewed it and thought. 26 people. He counted them all. 8 adult men, 6 women, 7 children between the ages of 3 and 12, 3 old men, 2 old women. Not enough men. There used to be more. He could tell by the number of sleeping places, by the width of the cave. This place was meant for 40 people. A third of them had disappeared, killed while hunting, or in raids. The second day began with Dan stepping out of the cave and walking around the camp. He was doing what he always did, surveying the area with an engineer's eye. A limestone cliff behind him. Good. A natural wall. The river was 200 meters away, a water source, but it was exposed on 3 sides. Any predator could approach unnoticed. Any group of people, too. Bones lay scattered around the cave, food scraps, pieces of hide, human excrement right at the entrance. Flies, the smell. Dan grimaced. He understood. These people don't know the connection between filth and disease. To them, disease is an evil spirit, or a punishment, or simply fate. He sat down on a rock and took out his tablet. He opened the offline archive, the section on primitive sanitation, the section on stone masonry, the section on traps for predators, the section on wild grains. The battery would last for years if he didn't keep the screen on for long. He flipped through a few pages and closed it. Everything he needed was already in his head. The tablet was just a backup. On the third day, Dan found tracks. He was walking along the river, gathering stones suitable for masonry, and he saw paw prints, large, four-toed, with deep claw grooves. Hyenas, cave hyenas. He'd seen pictures of them in textbooks, the size of a calf, jaws capable of snapping through a mammoth's femur. Pack animals, nocturnal. The tracks were fresh. A gnawed bone lay nearby, a large one, a deer's. Dan crouched down and examined the ground. The tracks led from the forest to the river and back. A trail. They come here regularly. And the trail ran 50 meters from the cave entrance. Dan stood up straight. They'll come tonight. Or tomorrow. It makes little difference. He returned to the camp. People were going about their business. The women were scraping hides. The men were shaping spearheads. The children were playing by the river. No one paid any attention to Dan. He was an outsider they tolerated, nothing more. Dan walked over to the willow thicket by the river and took out his multi-tool. He opened the knife. He began cutting off twigs, long, flexible ones, about as thick as a finger. He cut 8 of them. He sharpened each one at one end, a slanted cut, so they'd go into the ground more easily. Then he found an old hide discarded near the cave. He pulled the tendons out of it, long, strong. He picked up some bones from the trash pile, small ones, so they'd ring out when struck. The scarred hunter stopped and watched Dan work. Then he said something to the others. Someone laughed. Dan didn't turn around. He knew what it looked like from the outside. A skinny, pale stranger sticking sticks into the ground and tying bones to them. Madness. A child's game. He worked until dark. He drove the sticks into the ground in a semicircle in front of the cave entrance. Points facing outward, at an angle, at the chest height of a beast walking on all fours. He stretched sinews between the sticks. He hung the bones from the sinews. To rattle. A very simple system. A physical barrier plus an audible signal. The shaman Mora stepped out of the cave and looked at the contraption. Dan saw contempt in her eyes. She said something, and several hunters smirked. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. The outsider is playing with toys. He didn't bother to explain anything. He sat down at the entrance and waited. Night fell. The fire inside the cave burned steadily. Smoke drifted out through the crack. The people were asleep. Dan wasn't asleep. He sat against the wall and listened. 1 hour, 2, 3. Then he heard it. A rustle. Heavy paws on the ground, snorting. Not just one, several. A pack. Dan froze. His heart pounded against his ribs. A shadow emerged from the darkness, huge, low to the ground, broad, a head the size of a barrel. Eyes glinted in the firelight. The hyena was heading straight for the cave entrance, confidently, along its usual route. It slammed its chest into 2 sticks at once. The sharp ends pierced its flesh. The beast let out a shriek. The shriek was so piercing that Dan's whole body jerked, the hyena lurching backward, its tendons strained, its bones rattled. The roar echoed through the cliffs like thunder. The second hyena, following close behind, recoiled. The third turned and ran. The first wounded hyena wheezed and rolled on the ground. A pole jutted out of its chest. It tried to stand but couldn't. Hunters with spears burst out of the cave. Mora followed them out. Everyone stared at the creature thrashing in the mud. One of the hunters finished it off with a spear thrust to the neck. Silence. Everyone stood there looking at the dead hyena. It was the size of a calf. Its fangs were as long as a palm. This creature could have killed 2 people before anyone had a chance to raise a spear. Instead, it died on a stick. In the morning, the tribe gathered around the carcass. The children touched the dead paws. The hunters felt the stakes. A young man with a scar pulled one out of the ground and examined the tip. He looked at Dan. There was something new in his eyes. Not respect, not yet. but interest. Dan stood nearby and pointed at the sticks. He said one of the first words he'd learned over the past few days, a word he'd heard the hunters use when they talked about the rock overhang above the cave. Wall. Mora stood beside him. She stood in silence for a long time, staring at the dead hyena. Then she took the amulet off her neck, a bear's fang on a leather cord, and put it around Dan's neck. She said 2 words. Dan didn't understand them at the time. Later, he learned what they meant. The first meant, not food. The second meant, ours. Over the next few days, Dan learned the language. Not from books. Books didn't exist. He learned the way children do. He'd point at an object and wait for someone to name it. Stone, water, fire, hand, foot, tree, spear, hide, meat. He repeated each word 10 times. He wrote down the transcription on his tablet. He made charts, verbs, nouns, demonstratives. The children helped the most. For them, it was a game. They pointed at everything in sight and cackled when Dan mispronounced the words. A girl of about 7 turned out to be the best teacher. She patiently repeated each word until he pronounced it correctly. After a week, Dan could say simple things. Give. Take. There. Here. Good. Bad. After 2 weeks, he could form short sentences. I'm going to the river. I need fire. The rock is heavy. The tribe's language turned out to be rough and to the point. No abstractions. There was no word for a number greater than 2. 1, 2, many. There was no word for a future time beyond tomorrow. The day after tomorrow already merged with the future. There was no word for a drawing, for a plan, for a calculation. Dan understood why. These people had no need to plan beyond tomorrow morning. Every day was a struggle for the next day. As he learned the words, he observed. An engineer cannot help but observe. He watched as the hunters left at dawn and returned at sunset, sometimes with game, sometimes without. When there was no game, everyone ate yesterday's leftovers. When there were no leftovers, no one ate. He watched as the women scraped the hides, for hours, with stone scrapers, their hands covered in calluses and cracks. One hide takes 2 days of work, and after a month, it starts to rot anyway because they don't know how to tan it properly. He watched as the children drank water from the river, straight from the river, without boiling it. Upstream, all the camp's waste flowed into this same river. Dan clenched his teeth. Dysentery, parasites, infections. Half of these people's illnesses came from the water, but he couldn't explain it. He lacked the words. He lacked their trust. He was a stranger with an amulet around his neck, tolerated, but not one of them. The first thing he did after setting up the fire was to build an outhouse. He chose a spot behind a rock, further down the slope, away from the river. He dug a hole waist deep. He lined the edges with stones. He set up 2 vertical poles with a crossbar so he could sit. He covered it with branches and a hide to protect it from the rain. Then he went to Mora and tried for a long time to explain. Words weren't enough. He gestured. Mud, sickness, stomach, pain. Not there. Here, yes. Mora looked at him with an expression Dan had already learned to recognize. Patient bewilderment. The way people look at a child who says strange things. But she nodded, and told the others. Some listened, some didn't. The old men grumbled. The hunter with the scar, whose name was Bran, smirked openly. He said something to the others. Dan made out 2 words, stranger and playing. Dan didn't argue. He waited. A month later, those who had gone to the pit stopped having stomach aches. Those who hadn't gone were still sick as before. Mora noticed. She was a shaman. Her job was to notice connections between things, even if she explained them differently than Dan did. She came to him that evening and said one sentence. Dan didn't understand it completely, but he caught the gist. The spirits are pleased with the clean place. Dan nodded. Yes, the spirits are pleased, that'll do. The main thing is that it works. He moved on to the next task, pottery. The clay by the river was good. He tested it with his fingers, malleable, fine-grained, almost no sand, perfect for pottery. Dan shaped his first pot, small, crooked. The walls were uneven in thickness. He wasn't a potter, he was an engineer. He knew the principles, but his hands couldn't do what a master's hands could. He fired the pot in the fire. Wrong. Too fast. The pot cracked. He molded a second one. He fired it more slowly, adding wood gradually. He maintained the temperature. The second pot survived. Crooked and ugly, but intact. Dan poured water into it and set it over the fire. The water came to a boil. He watched the bubbles rising from the bottom and felt something tighten in his chest. 12,000 years. That's how long it took humanity to travel the path from this moment to the coffee maker. And all he needed was one crooked pot and 3 days. He called out to Mora. She came. He pointed to the boiling water. Mora watched. She saw the water bubbling in the stone bowl the stranger had made from river mud. She reached out and touched the side of the pot. She pulled her hand back. It's hot. Dan took a bunch of dried herbs that the women of the tribe had gathered for chewing. He tossed them into the boiling water. He waited. He took them out. He handed the pot to Mora. She looked at him suspiciously. Then she took the pot with both hands and drank. She drank slowly. Hot tea. The first of her life. Dan saw her face change. Surprise. Then something else. Something gentle. Warm. Her eyes glistened. She turned away, quickly, so he wouldn't see. But Dan saw. He understood. It wasn't about the pot. It wasn't about the tea. It was about the warmth. Warmth you could hold in your hands. Warmth that didn't burn like a campfire. Warmth you could drink. For someone who had spent her whole life either warming herself by an open fire or freezing, it was a miracle. Mora set the pot down on the ground. She turned to Dan. She spoke a long sentence. He understood only 2 words, builder and hands. Later, Hannah translated the entire meaning for him. The builder has hands that create warmth. From that day on, Mora stopped calling him a stranger. She called him builder. In the language of the river people, that word fell somewhere between shaman and father. Dan didn't know that then. He would find out later and wouldn't know where to look. The pot changed everything. Not right away, gradually. The women came to watch, then to try it themselves. The clay yielded to their hands better than it did to Dan's. They'd been sculpting their whole lives, figurines for the children, balls for games. They simply didn't know that you could make pottery out of it and fire it. Dan showed them, slowly, patiently. The thickness of the walls, drying, slow firing. The first 10 pots were ugly. The 11th turned out smooth. It was made by a quiet teenage girl, one of those who had come with the tribe. Slender fingers, endless patience. She twisted the walls and smoothed them out again and again until the pot was smooth. Dan looked at her and thought that if anyone here was going to become a master, it would be her. By the end of the first month, Dan knew the language well enough to speak. Not beautifully, not quickly, but well enough to be understood. And enough for him to understand what was happening around him. And bad things were happening. Fall was setting in. The nights were growing longer and colder. The hunters were returning with less game. The herds of deer that had grazed in the valley all summer began to head south. Fish in the river became scarcer. There were no meat reserves. These people didn't stockpile food. They ate what they killed that day. Tomorrow they would kill again. Or they might not. It had always been that way. Dan sat by the campfire that evening and did the math. 26 people. 6 of them were children under 10. 3 elderly people who needed more food than they could provide, the tribe's daily needs, hunting opportunities during the winter, the distance of their treks, the caloric content of jerky and dried roots. The numbers didn't add up. Without supplies, they wouldn't last 2 months. In 3 months, people would start dying of starvation. First, the elderly, then the children. That's math. Cold and simple. Dan went to see Mora. She was sitting by her fire, sorting through bones, divining. She was talking to the spirits. Dan sat down beside her and said that winter would be harsh. Mora looked at him and replied that winter was always harsh. Dan said there was a way to keep winter from killing them. Mora asked how. Dan began to explain. Meat can be dried and stored. Roots can be gathered in the fall and buried in a pit of dry sand. Fish can be caught in large quantities by damming a narrow part of the river with a stone weir. Hides can be sewn more tightly together by using a bone needle and sinew instead of simple knots. A cave can be insulated by sealing the entrance with a wall of stone and clay, leaving a single passageway. Mora listened. She didn't interrupt. That was one of her qualities. She knew how to listen in a way that made the speaker feel important. When Dan finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said one sentence. "Show me." In the morning, Dan started with the dam. He chose a spot on the river where the banks narrowed. The distance between them was no more than 10 steps. The riverbed was rocky. The current was moderate. The perfect spot. He began hauling stones. One. After another. Heavy. Wet. Slippery. After the 10th stone, his hands were shaking. After the 20th, he sat down on the bank and realized he couldn't do it. Physically, he couldn't do it. He needed a wall across the river. That meant hundreds of stones, tons of weight. His body wasn't built for this. Dan sat on the bank and stared at the water. Bran walked by. He stopped. He looked at the stones Dan had stacked across the current. He looked at Dan. He asked what he was doing. Dan explained, "A wall in the river. Water flows through the gaps. The fish don't get through. Lots of fish. Easy to catch." Bran looked at him as if he were sick. Then he said that fish were caught with a spear. That's how it had always been. That's the right way. Dan replied that with a spear you catch 1 fish. With a wall, you catch 20. Bran walked away. Dan continued hauling stones. By evening, he had built a barrier 2 steps long. Pitiful. Flimsy. Water flowed around it on both sides. He was wet and frozen, and his hands wouldn't obey him. In the morning, he went out to the river and saw a young hunter standing next to his line. The one with the scar. Bran. He was holding a stone, a big one that Dan couldn't have lifted even with both hands. Bran looked at Dan and silently placed the stone in the line. Then he went to get the next one. Dan didn't say a word. He just pointed where to put it. By noon, 2 more had arrived. By evening, there were 6 of them. Dan stood on the bank and gave directions. "This stone here, that one there, flat ones on the bottom, heavy ones on top. Fill the gaps with small ones." He didn't carry the stones, he directed, and the men listened. Not because they trusted him, but because they saw how the water slowed down against the wall. How small fish were already floundering in the trap between the stones. 3 days later, the weir was ready. Not perfect. Water was seeping through, but the fish were gathering in front of it. On the morning of the first day after it was finished, the women waded knee-deep into the water and scooped up with their hands as many fish as the hunters used to catch with spears in a week. Dan looked at their faces. Surprise, joy, something like disbelief, as if they couldn't believe this was really happening. They laid the fish out on the rocks to dry. Dan showed them how to do it right. Gut them, cut them open lengthwise, lay them out in the sun, sprinkle them with salt. They didn't have any salt. Dan found a salt flat a kilometer from the campsite, white crystals on the rocks by a small spring. He brought back a handful and rubbed it between his fingers. Salt, coarse, with impurities, but salt. He explained to Mora that salt keeps the meat from rotting. Mora tasted a crystal on her tongue. She grimaced. She looked at Dan. He saw in her eyes the question she had asked him more than once before. How do you know all this? Dan couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't say that he came from a world where people had learned to preserve food 10,000 years ago. That salt was one of the first forms of currency in human history. That even Neanderthals built dams, and he was simply repeating what had come before him. Instead, he said the spirits had shown him in a dream. Mora looked at him long and hard. She knew he was lying. You can't fool a shaman with stories about spirits. But she didn't press him further. Instead, she turned to the tribe and said that the builder was telling the truth, and that they needed to gather salt. Meanwhile, Dan was working on the cave. The entrance was too wide, 6 meters. At night, cold air rushed inside, and the heat from the hearth escaped outside. People slept in animal skins and were still freezing. Dan started building a wall. Not around the campsite, not yet. A wall at the cave's entrance. Stone and clay, the simplest masonry. He left a passageway wide enough for one person. He sealed off the rest. A layer of stone, a layer of clay, stone again. The wall reached knee-high, thin, crooked, but it was already altering the flow of air. Dan could feel it. It had gotten warmer inside. The wind beat against the wall and flowed around it instead of rushing straight into the cave. Every day he added another row. At first, the hunters walked around the wall, puzzled. Then they got used to it. Then they began to notice that it was warmer inside. No one said thank you. But Dan saw Bran sit down by the wall that evening with his back to it and leaned against it. The stone retained the heat of the hearth. Bran felt it, and he sat down right there. That was better than any thank you. The first snow fell on the 43rd day. Dan counted the days. He marked them on his tablet, an engineer's habit. Without dates, there's no schedule. Without a schedule, there's no project. The snow was light and wet. It melted before it even reached the ground. But the air had changed. It was sharp, biting. In the morning, the water in the pot by the entrance was covered with a thin crust of ice. Dan stood at the cave entrance and looked up at the gray sky. Winter was coming, faster than he'd hoped. The wall at the entrance had grown to chest height. Dan worked on it every day. He mixed clay with fine grass for strength. He selected stones by size. The wall was thick, 2 stones deep. He packed clay between the layers. It was a crude version of what builders of his time would have called double-layered masonry, with clay filling. He covered the opening with a hide stretched over a frame of poles. It became a door, the first door in the history of this tribe. It became noticeably warmer inside the cave. Dan gauged the difference by how it felt. Without a thermometer, it was impossible to be precise. But the difference between standing at the entrance and sitting inside was such that the children stopped coughing in the mornings. Old Tavi, who had coughed every night, now coughed only every other night. A small victory, an inconspicuous one, but to Dan it meant more than dozens of projects in his former life. Food supplies were growing. Fish were drying on the rocks. The women gathered roots and nuts and stored them in a pit lined with dry grass. The hunters brought back meat, and Dan showed them how to cut it into thin strips and dry it in the wind. The dried meat kept for weeks. It was a revelation. Before, the catch would spoil in 3 days, and the leftovers were thrown away. Now every piece mattered. Mora walked among the supplies and counted them. She counted in her own way. 1, 2, a lot. But even by her standards, a lot was noticeably more than usual. She looked at Dan and smiled for the first time. Not widely, not joyfully. Just the corners of her lips twitched. But Dan noticed it and remembered it. The cold was growing more intense. On the 50th day, real snow fell. It settled and didn't melt. A white blanket covered the valley. The river didn't freeze, but the current slowed. The weir was working. The fish swam toward it out of habit, and every morning the women pulled in the catch. But hunting had become more difficult. The herds had left. The deer that still remained in the valley were cautious and skittish. The hunters ventured farther and farther away and returned later and later. Once, 2 of them didn't return before dark. Mora stood at the entrance to the cave and gazed into the night. Dan stood beside her. He saw her clench her hands. How tense her back was. 2 hunters in the winter forest at night. Wolves, hyenas, bears, the cold. They returned at dawn, alive, without a kill, frozen blue. One of them was limping. He'd twisted his ankle on the icy slope. Dan examined his ankle. Swollen, not broken. A sprain. He applied a tight bandage made from a strip of hide and told him not to walk for 3 days. The hunter looked at him as if he were crazy. Not walking meant not hunting. Not hunting meant not eating. Dan said they had supplies. They could go without hunting for 3 days and no one would starve. The hunter looked at him, then at the jerky hanging on poles beneath the ceiling, then back at Dan, and he lay down. That was the moment. Small, quiet, but important. For the first time in his life, this man could afford to be sick. Dan kept working. He thought about the warmth. The cave was heated by the hearth, but unevenly. It was hot by the fire, cold by the walls. At night, people lay as close to each other as possible. Bodies, warmed bodies. Dan remembered. Ondol, the Korean underfloor heating system. The fire burns at one end. Hot smoke travels through channels under the floor. The floor heats up. The warmth rises. Evenly. Everywhere. He couldn't build a full-fledged ondol in the cave. There weren't enough materials. There weren't enough hands. He didn't have enough time. But the principle could be simplified. Dan chose a section of the floor by the far wall. That's where Mora and the 2 youngest children slept. He dug a shallow trench from the hearth to the wall. He placed flat stones at the bottom. He covered them with more of the same. It formed a channel. Hot air from the hearth could flow through it beneath the stone floor. In theory. He tested it. He lit a fire. He waited an hour. He placed his hand on the stones by the wall. Warm. Not hot. Warm. Dan closed his eyes. It worked. Mora came in that evening. She lay down in her spot and froze. She was lying on the warm stone for the first time. Dan saw it from his corner. He saw her press her palms against the floor. How she turned onto her side. How she pulled the child sleeping next to her closer. She laid him on the warm stone. The child stirred. He sniffled. He didn't wake up. He didn't cough. Dan turned away toward the wall. Engineers don't cry. They're just rocks with hot air beneath them. Physics, thermal conductivity, convection. Nothing special. Winter was bearing down. On the 60th day, the temperature dropped so low that Dan could see his breath inside the cave. The snow at the entrance was knee-deep. The forest was silent. The birds had vanished. Even the wolves howled less often. The world was shrinking. Dan took stock of his supplies. Fish, dried meat, roots, nuts, salt. He divided everything into portions and counted the days. 60 days until spring. If he calculated conservatively, his supplies would last 40. 20 days of shortfall. 20 days when people would go hungry. Not fatal if rationed properly, but hard. He went to Mora with these numbers, tried to explain. Mora listened. Then she said that in the past, people had already been dying by this time. Every winter. 1, 2, sometimes more. Children, the elderly, the weak. She spoke of it calmly, as if discussing the weather. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd known it her whole life. Death in winter was as natural as snow. Dan said that no one would die this winter. Mora looked at him. There was something strange in her eyes. Not mockery, not disbelief, something like fear. She said, "You couldn't promise that. The spirits don't like it when people speak for them." Dan replied that he wasn't speaking for the spirits. He was speaking for the stones and the clay and the supplies. Mora shook her head and walked away. She thought he was crazy. Maybe she was right. But Dan had already done the math. 20 days of shortage. He needed to increase the catch, or reduce consumption, or both. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he found a solution: traps. Not for hyenas, for small game, hares, partridges, foxes. He saw their tracks every day when he walked to the river. The small game hadn't gone anywhere. It was right there, under the snow, in burrows, in the bushes. Hunters paid no attention to it. They hunted big game, deer, wild boars. That was the custom. Small game was looked down upon. Dan began building traps, the simplest kind. Noose traps made of sinew tied to a bent branch. Lever action snares. Holes covered with branches. He set 12 of them around the campsite in places where he'd seen tracks. The first morning, nothing. The second, nothing. The third, a hare. White, large, entangled in the snare and frozen solid overnight. Dan brought it into the cave. The children shouted with joy. The women immediately began to skin it. Bran looked at the hare, then at Dan. Then at the trap Dan was holding in his hands. He said nothing. But the next morning, Dan saw Bran by the river. He was carving a stick and bending it. Wrong. Dan walked over and silently showed him how it was done. Bran clenched his jaw. Pride. But he let Dan show him. A week later, the traps were bringing in 2 or 3 hares a day. A partridge every other day. 1 fox. Small game. But small game that made up for that very 20-day shortfall. The numbers began to add up. Dan recounted his supplies and exhaled, for the first time in a month. It's enough. It should be enough, if nothing happens. Winter really set in on the 70th day. The frost was so severe that the trees in the forest creaked like breaking bones. The river froze along the banks. The dam stopped working. The fish had gone deep. The traps were yielding less. The hares had burrowed into their dens and wouldn't come out. Dan counted their supplies again. 40 days. If they cut back on portions, 50. Just barely. The people stayed in the cave and didn't go out unless they had to. The wall at the entrance kept the heat in. The ondol was working. But the air inside had grown heavy, the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke, and old hides. Dan endured it. Everyone endured it. There was no choice. On the 75th day, the old woman Tavi fell ill. A fever, a cough, wheezing in her chest. Mora sat beside her and burned bundles of dry herbs. She whispered. She called upon the spirits. Dan sat in his corner and watched. He's not a doctor. He doesn't know how to treat pneumonia without antibiotics. But he knows that warmth is better than cold. That a hot drink is better than cold water, that fresh air is better than smoke. He moved Tavi's bed closer to the ondol. He placed dry animal hides beneath her. Every 2 hours, he brought her a pot of hot herbal tea. Mora watched. She didn't interfere. She didn't help. She just watched. 3 days later, Tavi's condition worsened. She stopped drinking. She stopped opening her eyes. Her breathing became ragged. Mora said the spirits were calling her. Dan clenched his fists. No, not this winter. He had promised. He heated stones in the hearth and arranged them around Tavi's bed, not right up against it, a palm's width away. Heat radiated from all sides. He made a canopy of hides over the bed so the warm air wouldn't escape upward. A small tent inside the cave. An improvised warming chamber. Absurd by the standards of his world, normal by the standards of this one. On the 4th day, Tavi opened her eyes. She asked for water. Mora gave her some hot broth. Tavi drank it. She coughed, but she drank it. On the 7th day, she sat there eating hair broth. Mora stood nearby, looking at Dan. He didn't understand the expression on her face. Later, he would realize that this was the moment when Mora finally decided that this man would stay by her side forever. Not as a stranger, not as a builder, but as someone else. Winter dragged on. The 99th day. The 100th. Their supplies were dwindling. Dan was the first to cut back on his portion. He ate less than anyone else. Bran noticed. One evening, he silently placed a piece of jerky next to Dan. A big one. His own. Dan looked at him. Bran didn't look back. He had already gone to his sleeping place. Dan ate the meat and remembered. On the 110th day, Dan realized they had to leave the cave. The people were growing weak. Not from hunger, from inactivity. The hunters' muscles had grown soft. The children had stopped running. Even Bran was moving more slowly. Dan went outside. The frost stung his face. The snow was waist deep. But the sun was out, bright, fierce. He squinted. He looked at the cliff above the cave. Limestone, soft by rock standards, easy to cut, easy to work with. Dan made his way down to the river. The ice was thick. He walked out to the middle and didn't fall through. He returned to the cave and began to count. A wall. A real wall. Not just a partition at the entrance. A wall surrounding the clearing in front of the cave. In a semicircle, from one cliff edge to the other. Inside the wall was a courtyard. You could walk in the courtyard. Work. Live. Without fear that a beast would emerge from the forest. He estimated the dimensions. 30 paces along the arc, a height of 1.5 times a man's height, a thickness of 2 stones. That's hundreds of stone blocks, tons of clay, months of work. But now it's winter, and people are sitting around with nothing to do. They have hands, they have stone. The clay is frozen, but it can be thawed by the fire. Dan went to Mora. He explained, at length, in detail. He drew on the ground with a stick. Here's a cave, here's a cliff, here's a wall, here's a courtyard. Mora listened. Then she called Bran. Dan explained it again. Bran looked at the drawing and frowned. Then he asked why. The beast doesn't come in winter. Dan replied that the wall wasn't just for the beast. People. Other people. Bran fell silent. He knew what Dan was talking about. 2 raids in the last year. 1/3 of the men had been killed. The Grey Wolves. Bran had heard that name before, and his expression changed. His jaw clenched. The scar on his cheek turned white. He'd lost a brother in those raids. Dan didn't know the details, but he'd seen how Bran looked toward the southwest when he thought no one was watching. Bran asked how many men were needed. Dan replied, "Everyone. Everyone who can carry a stone." Bran smirked. Then he stood up and walked out. In the morning, all the men of the tribe gathered at the clearing in front of the cave. 7 of them. Bran stood at the front, looking at Dan. He waited. Dan demonstrated. He marked out the line of the wall with stones in the snow. He showed where to dig the foundation. He explained the principle. Large stones at the bottom, with the flat side facing out. Clay between the layers. Each row staggered. The men worked in silence. They were used to hard labor. Hauling stones was no harder than dragging a deer carcass through the forest. But it was unfamiliar. Pointless by their standards. They worked because Bran told them to, and Bran told them to because he remembered his brother. Dan stood on the work platform and directed them. This stone goes here. Turn this one. Add some clay here. Level it out here. He wasn't giving orders, he demonstrated. The difference is subtle but important. A chieftain commands, a teacher demonstrates. These people would not have tolerated an outsider as a commander, but they tolerated an outsider as a teacher. The wall grew slowly. Winter days are short. The frost stung their hands. The clay froze in the bucket, and had to be warmed by the fire. But every day, they added 1 row of stones. 1 row. 8 centimeters high. Dan counted them and recorded the measurements on his tablet. By the 20th day of construction, the wall had reached waist height. By the 30th, it was chest high. Dan realized he wouldn't finish by spring, but the foundation had been laid. And the most important thing didn't happen on the construction site. The most important thing happened within the people. They worked together, all of them, every day, for a common cause. Not for the game they'd eat that evening, for the stones that would still be standing tomorrow, the day after, and a year from now. They were building the future, and they didn't know it. Only Dan knew. On the 140th day, it began to warm up. The snow started to settle. Streams began to flow from the cliff. The ice on the river cracked. In the morning, Dan stepped out of the cave and heard a bird, the first one in 3 months. He stood there and listened. Then he smiled. Spring arrived wet and muddy. The snow melted, and the ground turned to slush. The river swelled and rose a meter. The dam was submerged. Dan stood on the bank and watched as the current washed away the stones they had laid in the fall. Half a day's work, and he'd reinforce it again. But first, he had to wait for the water to recede. He returned to the wall. The work continued. The ground had thawed, and the clay had become malleable. Stones lay all around in abundance. The cliff provided as much limestone as they needed. Dan taught the 2 men to chisel off blocks of the right size, not to strike randomly, but to strike along the cracks. Nature had already marked the stone. You just had to see the line and strike correctly. One of the 2 learned in 3 days, the other in a week. Dan watched their hands and thought that these men weren't stupid. They just didn't know. No one had shown them. For thousands of years, no one had shown them. But now he had shown them, and they were doing it. The wall closed in a semicircle by the end of the 2nd month of spring. It was 1.5 times a person's height, 2 stones thick, rough, uneven. No mortar in the upper rows because the clay didn't set fast enough. But it was a wall, a real one, the first in the world. Dan stood in front of it and looked at it. He had built skyscrapers, arcologies for 200,000 people, domes capable of withstanding an asteroid impact. And now, he stood before a crooked stone wall, 2.5 meters high, and felt something he had never felt once in his entire career. Pride. Real. Heavy. Alive. Mora came to the wall at dawn. She placed her hand on the stones. She closed her eyes. She stood there for a long time. Then she turned to Dan and said the wall was warm. Dan explained. The stones heat up in the sun and give off heat. Limestone retains heat well. Mora shook her head. That wasn't what she meant. She said the wall was alive, that it had a spirit. Dan didn't argue. If the wall was alive to Mora, then let it be alive. What mattered was that it stood. Spring brought new tasks. Dan walked along the river every morning. He was searching. Not stones, not clay, plants. At a bend in the river, he found what he'd been looking for since day 1. Wild barley. Thin stalks with small spikelets. The grains were small, tough, but they were grains. Dan gathered a handful and brought them back to the cave. He showed them to Mora. She looked at them and shrugged. Grass. They knew this grass. Sometimes they chewed the grains when there was absolutely nothing else to eat. Bitter. Tough. Food of desperation. Dan asked Mora for a patch of land, 10 paces by 10, at the foot of the cliff where the sun stayed warm the longest. Mora agreed. She was already used to the stranger asking for strange things that later turned out to be useful. Dan cleared the patch. He removed the rocks and pulled out the roots. He loosened the soil with a stick that had a pointed end, a primitive hoe. Then he took some barley grains and stuck them into the ground, one by one, in rows, spaced a palm's width apart. The children stood around and watched. They didn't understand what he was doing. Why bury food in the ground? Food is meant to be eaten, not buried. Dan didn't explain. He watered them. He waited. 8 days later, green shoots emerged from the ground. Thin, delicate. The first cultivated plants in the history of this world. Dan stood over them and felt strange. He had just set in motion a process that would change everything. Agriculture. The beginning of a settled life. The beginning of civilization. All of this from a handful of grains and a 10 by 10 plot of land. Mora came to look at the sprouts every day. She didn't understand what was happening, but she could see that Dan was serious. And when a builder is serious, it means the matter is important. At the same time, Dan was building a watchtower. 4 posts driven into the ground. A platform on top made of poles woven together with branches. 3 men tall. From there, you could see the entire valley all the way to the forest. Bran climbed up first. He stood at the top and looked out. For a long time. Then he climbed down and said that from a spot like this, you could see the enemy 1,000 steps away. Dan nodded. That was the point. Bran looked at him differently. Not like a stranger, not like a teacher. Like a person who thinks the same way he does. About safety, about protection. About the fact that people would come who would want to take all of this away. And they had to be ready. Bran said one sentence. Dan understood it completely. They're coming. The gray wolves. Dan replied that he knew. Bran asked when. Dan replied that he didn't know, but the wall would be ready. Bran smiled. The first smirk that wasn't a mockery. The first smirk that was approval. Weeks passed. The barley grew. The wall grew stronger. Dan filled the cracks with clay mixed with straw. He couldn't make lime mortar yet. He needed a kiln to burn limestone. He needed a temperature of 900 degrees. He needed coal. All that lay ahead. For now, there was enough clay. One morning, strangers arrived at the camp. 3 of them. 2 men and a woman. Thin, dirty, frightened. They had come from the east, from a tribe Dan didn't know. Mora went out to meet them beyond the wall. She spoke for a long time. Dan stood nearby and listened. He didn't understand everything, but he caught the gist of it. Their tribe had been ravaged. The gray wolves had come at night. They'd killed the men and taken their food. The rest had fled. These 3 had been walking for 5 days. They'd been eating bark and drinking from puddles. Mora turned to Dan. There was a question in her eyes. Dan answered without hesitation. Let them in. Feed them. Give them a place to stay. Mora nodded. Not because he was in charge, because she felt the same way. The 3 were led inside the wall. They were given meat, hot broth, a place by the fire. They ate greedily. The woman was crying. One of the men saw the wall and froze. He touched the stones. He looked at the masonry. Then he looked at Dan and asked who had built it. Mora answered for Dan. A builder. The man looked at Dan and dropped to his knees. Dan lifted him up by the shoulders. Don't. Stand up. Look ahead. No one kneels here. These were the first newcomers, but not the last. The rumor spread. Slowly, like everything else in this world, but it spread. Somewhere by the river, beneath a cliff, there's a place. There's a wall there. There's a fire there. There's food there. People don't die there in the winter. By midsummer, 42 people were living in the settlement. 3 of the newcomers stayed and worked. Then 4 more arrived from the south. Then a family of 5 from the north. A man, a woman, 3 children. They'd walked for 10 days through the forest because they'd heard from nomads that there were people by the river behind a stone wall who would let them in. Dan assessed each newcomer with an engineer's eye, not as livestock, as a resource. This man is tall and strong, a stonemason. This woman is quick and agile, a hunter. This old man knows herbs, a healer. He found a place for each of them, not a place to sleep, a place within the system. because the settlement was already a system. Dan saw this more clearly with each passing day. People, food, water, warmth, protection, morale, growth. 7 elements. Each depends on the others. Take away one, and everything falls apart. The barley had grown. A small plot, 10 by 10, yielded more grain than Dan had expected. The soil turned out to be rich. The river fed the groundwater. The sun provided warmth. Dan harvested the crop and divided the grain into 2 parts, one to eat, the other to plant, to double the area. He explained this to Moore. She understood immediately. The shaman thought in cycles: birth, growth, death, birth again, grain into the earth, grain from the earth, more grain into the earth, more grain from the earth. She said it was like the words of the spirits. Dan didn't argue. 6 months after their arrival, Dan built his first house. Not a cave, not a shelter. A house. 4 walls of stone and clay. A roof of poles covered with animal hides and smeared with clay. A doorway. A window. A small one, with a wooden shutter. A hearth against the far wall with a chimney leading through the roof. The floor was packed down and covered with dry grass. The house was small, 3 steps by 4, for one family. But it stood, separate from the cave, behind a wall. The first building constructed by human hands in this world. People walked around it and touched the walls. They peered inside. One of the men who had come stood in the doorway and couldn't bring himself to enter. He stood there and watched. Then he turned to Dan and said he wanted one just like it, for his children. Dan nodded. He'd show him how. A month later, 3 houses stood side by side. Dan built the first one. The second one, the people built themselves under his guidance. The third one, they built almost entirely on their own. He only checked the masonry and adjusted the angle of the chimney. Knowledge was being passed on. That was what mattered most. Not the house. The skill of building a house. A skill that would outlive Dan. One evening a girl approached him. A young girl. Tall. With a bow on her back and a knife at her belt. Bran's niece. Kyra. Dan knew her name. He saw her every day. She would set out to hunt before the men and return later. She brought back more game than 2 adult hunters combined. Silent. Tough. From the very first day, she'd looked at Dan as if he were a nobody, a pale outsider who couldn't run 100 steps without getting out of breath. Kyra walked up and said she wanted to shoot from farther away. Dan looked at her bow. Simple, made from a single piece of wood, unevenly bent. The bowstring was made of sinew. The arrows had no fletching. This bow shot 30 paces, maybe 40. Dan knew how to make a better one, a composite bow. Wood, bone, and sinew, a layered construction. The wood on the inside resists compression. The sinew on the outside works under tension. The bone at the ends provides elasticity. A bow like that shoots 3 times farther. He told Kyra he could do it. But it would take time. A moon, maybe more. The glue made from fish bladders had to dry. Kyra looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and left. Without a word. Dan set to work. He carved the base out of ash wood. He found a straight branch without a single knot. He split it and whittled it down. He glued strips of sinew along the outside. For the glue, he boiled fish bladders in a pot. A thick, sticky mass. It stank terribly, but it held. He tied and glued strips of deer bone to the ends. He let it dry for 3 weeks. He checked it every day. He pulled it taut. He let it go. He pulled it taut again. When the bow was ready, Dan made the arrows. Straight ones, fletched with partridge feathers. 3 feathers on each arrow, at an angle, so the arrow would spin in flight and fly straight. He called for Kyra. She came. She took the bow. She turned it over in her hands. She tugged at the bowstring. Her face showed no emotion. Dan set up a target, a bundle of branches on a pole, 100 paces away. Kyra drew the bow. The arrow flew and hit the mark. Kyra froze. She looked at the target. She looked at the bow. 100 paces. Her old bow hadn't even reached 70. She turned to Dan. In her eyes was something he'd never seen before. Not respect, not gratitude. Hunger. A ravenous, frenzied hunger. More. She wanted to shoot again. Dan gave her 10 arrows. Kyra shot them all. 7 out of 10 hit the target. At 100 paces. With her new bow. On her first try. Dan watched this and realized that he wasn't just looking at a hunter. He was looking at a warrior. A natural-born one. Precise. Ruthless. And this warrior had just received a weapon that made her more dangerous than any man in the tribe. Kyra lowered her bow. She looked at Dan. She said one sentence. "You're not as weak as you look." Dan replied that strength isn't about muscles. Strength is leverage. Kyra frowned. She didn't understand the word leverage, but she understood the meaning. She turned and walked away with her bow. From that day on, she stopped calling it a stick. She stopped calling it anything at all. She would simply come in the evening and sit beside him, silently, and she'd leave, silently. Dan didn't understand what it meant. Bran did. He looked at Dan one evening after Kyra had left, and he shook his head. But there was no disapproval in his eyes. Rather, the weary resignation of an uncle who knows his niece does as she pleases. Summer was coming to an end when Hana So arrived. Alone, on foot, from the south, barefoot, wearing tattered hides, so thin that her ribs jutted out beneath her skin like poles under a canopy. But she walked straight ahead, without staggering, looking straight ahead. The sentry in the watchtower spotted her 1,000 steps away. Bran came out with 2 hunters. They brought her to the wall. Mora examined her. Wounds on her legs, burns on her arms, old ones, healed crookedly. Mora asked where she was from. Kana named her tribe. Mora knew it. Far away. 3 moons' journey to the south. Good people, traders, goat hunters in the mountain valleys. Mora asked where the others were. Kana answered briefly. Dead. That's all. The gray wolves came at dawn. They killed the men right away. They took the women. They left the children behind. Hana ran. She headed north because she'd heard from a captive she'd glimpsed that there was a place behind a wall by the river up north. She walked for 3 moons, alone. Through the forests, through the mountains. She ate roots. She drank from streams. She hid from a bear in a crevice and sat there for 2 days. She swam across a river where she nearly drowned. Dan listened and said nothing. He saw before him a person who had gone through the end of the world and hadn't broken. Hana spoke calmly, without tears, without a tremor in her voice. She spoke of the destruction of her people as if it were the weather. But her eyes, Dan saw her eyes, heavy, dark, the eyes of a person who carries an entire cemetery within herself. They put her in a cave. They gave her food, clothes, a place to stay. 3 days later, Hana was already walking around the village and talking to people. She spoke 3 languages, the language of her dead tribe, the language of the river people, which was different from her own but understandable, and in the language of the southern mountain people. 3 languages in a world where most people know only one. Dan spoke to her on the 4th day. He asked how many songs she knew. Hana looked at him in surprise. No one here had ever asked about songs. She replied that she knew them all the songs of her people, all the stories, all the names, everyone who had lived and died. She was the keeper of memory. That was the name of her role in the tribe. She memorized everything, every word, every name, every turn of every trail. Dan realized who he was looking at, a living library, a human archive. Without a written language, without books, without a single written word, The entire culture of a whole people was stored in a single mind. And if that mind died, everything would die. Dan told Hannah that he wanted to show her something. He took out his tablet. Hannah took a step back. She saw the screen glow, a flat spirit. That's what Maura called it. Dan opened a blank page. He picked up the stylus and drew a simple symbol, a circle with a wavy line at the bottom. Water. He showed it to Hannah. He said the word, water. He pointed to the symbol, water. Hannah watched. Then he drew a second symbol, a triangle with a line of smoke, fire. The third, a figure with 2 legs and 2 arms, a person. Hannah watched intently. She understood instantly, without explanation. A symbol is a word. A word can be drawn. A drawn word never dies. She reached out and took the stylus. Dan led her. Hannah drew a symbol, a circle with a dot inside. She looked at Dan and said the word in her own language. Dan didn't know it. Hannah translated it. Sun. Then she drew another one, 2 circles side by side. Eyes. Then another, and another. She drew and drew. In an hour, she created 20 symbols, 50 in a day. She wasn't just copying Dan. She was creating a system, her own, based on his idea but different, better, simpler. Each symbol resembled what it represented but was simple enough to draw with a stick on clay. Dan watched and felt goosebumps run down his spine. He'd given her an idea. She'd turned it into a language. That evening, Dan sat next to Hannah by the campfire. She was drawing symbols on a flat stone with a charred stick, silently, intently. Dan said that now her people wouldn't die. She could record all the names, all the songs, all the stories. They would lie on the clay and stone and wait, 1,000 years if necessary. Hannah stopped. She set down the stick. She looked at her hands, then at Dan. She wasn't crying. She couldn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry during her 3-moon journey through the realm of the dead. But Dan saw her shoulders tremble for a moment. Then she straightened up and picked up the stick again and continued writing. That night, Hannah slept peacefully. Maura told Dan about it in the morning. It was the first time since she'd arrived. No screaming, no moaning. She just slept. Dan nodded and walked over to the wall. He had a lot of work to do. The moat. The next level of defense. The wall is good, but the enemy can get right up close to it. A moat in front of the wall won't let them. Waist deep, 2 paces wide. The moat's walls were vertical on the outside and sloped on the inside. An escarp. The enemy could jump into the moat easily, but would have a hard time climbing out. And while they were climbing out, they'd be shot from above. Dan started digging. Alone, as always, showing the way. By the 3rd day, 4 men were digging alongside him. By the 10th day, the moat ran the entire length of the wall. The earth from the moat was hauled upward. Dan piled it up behind the wall, creating a rampart. The wall plus the rampart. From the outside, the enemy sees 3 meters of stone. From the inside, the defender stands on the rampart and looks down from above. Bran walked along the moat and nodded. He understood. No words. No calculations. He understood the idea. The enemy is below. You're above. The enemy is in the pit. You're on the wall. This isn't cowardice. It's smart. Bran began training the men. On his own initiative. Without Dan's orders. He stationed them on the wall and made them throw spears down into the moat, at a scarecrow made of animal hides stuffed with grass. Over and over. Dan watched and felt grateful. Bran was a warrior. Bran understood war. Dan understood walls. Together, they covered both sides of the same task. By the end of summer, the settlement was unrecognizable. The wall, the moat, the watchtower, 5 houses, a pottery area where 3 women shaped pots every day, a barley field 4 times larger than before, a drying shed for meat and fish, an outhouse behind the rock that everyone, without exception, now used. Dan stood on the watchtower and looked down. 42 people. Alive, well-fed, protected. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to think that maybe he would manage after all. The first scout appeared in early fall. Bran spotted him from the watchtower. A lone figure at the edge of the forest, standing, watching, not hiding. Bran climbed down and went to Dan. He said one word, "Wolf." Dan climbed up to the watchtower. The man at the edge of the forest was tall, clad in gray furs, with an axe at his belt, made of stone but large, a battle axe, not for chopping wood, for chopping people. He stood there and looked at the wall, at the moat, at the watchtower. Then he turned and walked back into the forest. Dan climbed down. He looked at Bran. Bran was staring toward the forest, his face as hard as stone. "They know about us." Dan replied that he'd known this for a long time. "The wall doesn't hide. The wall protects. The scout will come again. He'll bring others. They'll watch and count. Then they'll tell their chieftain. Then the chieftain will decide." Bran asked what to do. Dan replied that they should build. Faster. 3 days later, 2 more arrived. They stood farther away, right at the edge of the trees. They watched for half a day. Then they left. A week later, 4 more came. One of them approached closer, all the way to the moat. He looked down. He touched the wall with his hand. Bran stood above with his spear. They stared at each other. The scout smirked and walked away. Bran didn't drop his spear. Dan asked why. Bran replied that killing the scout would mean declaring war, and they weren't ready yet. Dan nodded. Bran thought strategically. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a commander. It was just that he'd never had to command anything other than a hunting party before. Dan picked up the pace. The wall needed reinforcing. He added buttresses, stone projections on the inner side every 10 paces. They supported the wall and provided platforms for archers. Kyra had suggested this, not Dan. Kyra. She'd come to him that morning and said she needed a spot high up on the wall from which to shoot. Not just the edge of the wall, a platform, with protection, so she could stand and shoot without fear of a rock hitting her in the head. Dan looked at her and smiled. She had described a loophole without even knowing the word, without knowing that such a thing would be invented 10,000 years from now. She came up with it herself because she's a warrior and thinks like a warrior. Dan built 3 platforms, made of stone, with low walls, waist high, with slits for shooting. Kyra climbed onto the first one. She stood up, raised her bow, looked through the slit. The entire valley stretched out before her, all the way to the forest, an open space, 200 steps. With her new bow, she could cover every meter. Kyra looked up at Dan from below. He was standing at the foot of the wall, his head tilted back. She said it was a good spot. Dan replied that it was her spot. Kyra said nothing. But she didn't leave the clearing until evening. Dan set to work on something else. A bathhouse. Not a luxury, a necessity. 42 people in a cramped space. Skin diseases, parasites, the smell. He built a small structure out of stone and clay by the stream behind the wall. A hearth inside. Stones heated over the fire. Water from the stream to pour over the stones. Steam, heat, cleanliness. The children went in first, because children are afraid of nothing. They squealed and cackled in the hot steam. Then the women came. Then the men. Bran went in last. He came out red-faced and steamed. He looked at Dan and said that the hot steam drives evil spirits out of the body. Dan replied that yes, that's exactly right. Mora went into the sauna alone, in the evening, when everyone else had left. Dan didn't see her, but in the morning she came to him and said that the water had taken the pain away from her back. Dan knew about her back. He'd seen how she moved, how she bent over with difficulty, how she always sat up straight because bending over hurt. Years of work, years of cold, years of sleeping on stone. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. A house for Mora, a special one, with underfloor heating using the Ondal system. Not just a groove in the floor like in a cave, a proper heated floor, with a hearth by the entrance and channels running beneath the entire floor, so the floor would always be warm, so she could lie down without feeling the cold of the stone. He began to build, in silence, without telling anyone. A separate house by the cliff, small, for one person. Walls 2 stones thick, a roof of poles and clay, a floor of flat stone slabs laid over the channels. He worked in the evenings when everyone else was already resting. 1 week, 2, 3. When the house was ready, he went to Mora and said he wanted to show her something. Mora followed him. She went inside. She stopped. A fire was burning in the hearth by the entrance. Smoke flowed down into the channels under the floor and exited through a chimney by the far wall. The floor was warm, all of it, from the entrance to the far corner. Mora dropped to her knees and placed her palms on the stone. Warm, even, smooth. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. He said that the children who came to her to learn would sit on this floor, and they wouldn't cough, like her child. Mora didn't move. She remained on her knees, her shoulders trembling. Dan went out. He closed the hide door behind him. He stood outside for a moment. He looked up at the sky. Then he walked over to the wall to check the masonry. In the morning, Mora stepped out of the new house. She didn't say anything to Dan. But that evening she sat down next to him by the communal fire, close, shoulder to shoulder. And she didn't move away all evening. Bran watched. Kyra watched. Hannah watched. No one said anything, but everyone understood. The Stone Creek tribe arrived in the 8th month. 30 people, women, children, the elderly. 10 men, 4 of whom were wounded. Their chief had been killed in a skirmish with the Grey Wolves scouts a week ago. They were heading north, toward the place beyond the wall that everyone had been talking about. Mora met them at the gate. Dan stood nearby. He looked at these people and saw something familiar. Fear, hunger, exhaustion. And beneath it all, a faint, trembling hope. He said to let them all in. Bran objected. 30 mouths to feed. There wouldn't be enough food. Dan replied that 30 mouths also meant 30 pairs of hands. Hands were more necessary than food. Bran clenched his jaw but said nothing. Mora nodded. The decision was made. Among those who arrived was a girl, Lena, 16 years old. They brought her in half dead from starvation. Her skin was stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were enormous on her gaunt face. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there and stared. Her mother and brother had frozen to death last winter in a cave, right next to her. She woke up that morning between 2 cold bodies. Ever since then, she's always been cold. Dan saw her huddling by the fire, how she crept closer and closer to the hearth, until the edge of the fur on her shoulders began to smoke. How she was still cold. He gave her a job. Clay. Pots. Lena took the clay in her hands and froze. Then she began to knead it. Slowly, carefully. Her fingers moved as if they'd been doing this their whole lives. She shaped her first pot in an hour. Even. Smooth. The walls were all the same thickness. Better than anything Dan had made in half a year. He watched her hands and realized he was looking at a talent. A rare one. A natural one. Dan built a pottery workshop for her, a small one, made of stone, with 2 kilns, one large one for firing, hot and voracious. The second one was small, cozy, always warm, just for her. He told her that here she would never be cold again. Lena nodded, silently. That evening, he found a small clay figurine under her cot. A man in strange clothes, overalls. His arms were spread out to the sides, as if he were pointing something out. Dan put the figurine back and said nothing. The settlement now numbered 72 people. Dan revised his plan. They needed more houses, more fields, more supplies. Winters here are deadly, and they needed to prepare twice as much food for the next one. He organized the work. He divided the people into groups: masons, potters, farmers, hunters, and guards. Each group had a task. Each person had a place. Bran commanded the hunters and the guards. Kyra led a small squad of 5 archers, whom she armed with composite bows modeled after her own. Dan taught her how to make them. She taught the others how to shoot. Hannah kept records. Everything. Every day. How many stones were laid? How many pots were fired? How much grain was harvested? Pictograms on clay tablets. The world's first record-keeping. The world's first archive. Dan looked at these tablets and saw in them the beginning of what, thousands of years later, would become libraries and universities and data storage servers. For now, it was just clay with stick figures. But it worked. One evening, Una arrived. She wasn't fleeing from the gray wolves. She came riding a horse, the first horse Dan had ever seen in this world. Not a riding horse in the usual sense. Semi-wild, small, shaggy. Una sat on it as if it were a dog and steered it with her knees. 2 men with spears followed behind her, guards. Una was the daughter of the chief of the southern tribe. 22 years old, striking, beautiful, dressed in animal skins embroidered with colored stones, a necklace of river shells around her neck. She dismounted at the gate and surveyed the wall, the moat, the watchtower, the houses, the barley field, the bathhouse, the potter's workshop. All this took her a minute. Then she turned to Dan and said in broken river people language that her father had sent a gift. Dan asked what kind. Una pointed to herself. Dan was silent for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Mora. Mora looked at Una expressionlessly, then at Dan, then back at Una. The situation was clear. A political alliance through marriage. Business as usual in this world. Una's father wanted to be an ally of a powerful outsider beyond the wall, and he sent his daughter as a pledge. Una stood up straight and looked at Dan defiantly. She was preparing to hate him. No one had asked her. She had been sent like an object, like a beautiful coin in exchange for safety. Dan told her to come in. He gave her food, a hot broth, and a place to sit. And then he did something Una hadn't expected. He didn't lead her to his sleeping platform. He led her to the negotiating table, a large, flat stone under a canopy where Dan laid out maps and plans. He asked how many languages she knew. Una replied, 5. Dan nodded. Then he said he knew 2, his native tongue, which was useless here, and the language of the river people. 2 languages for a man trying to unite peoples. That's nothing, but 5 is power. Una looked at him, not understanding. Dan said he needed someone who would speak to foreign tribes on his behalf, to trade, to negotiate, to persuade. Someone who knows 5 languages and knows how to win people over. He asked if she could handle it. Una was silent for a long time. Then she said he was a strange man, and that she really did think she'd end up marrying him. By the anniversary of Dan's arrival in this world, the settlement had turned into something for which the river people had no name. 187 people. A stone wall with buttresses and battlements, a moat with a scarp, a watchtower, 12 houses, a potter's workshop, fields of barley, a pen for 4 semi-tamed goats that Una had traded for clay pots from the southern tribe, a bathhouse, a granary, a communal house with a large hearth where everyone gathered. Dan stood on the watchtower and looked out. He remembered how, a year ago, he had lain face down in the clay in the rain. alone, without a language, without people, without hope. And now, a small world lived beneath him, rough, imperfect, but alive. Winter had passed, the second winter of his life here, and again, not a single death, not a single one. Mora gathered everyone in the communal house on the last evening of winter. Dan sat in a corner. Mora stood by the fire and said one word, "Count," and the people began to call out their names, one by one. Bran, Kyra, Lena, Hannah, Una, name after name, voice after voice. 187. Not a single one missing. Old woman Tavi stood up last. She said she remembered 7 winters, that after every winter they counted who the night had taken. And today, for the first time, they were counting who was left. And she said her name. Silence. Then someone slapped their knee with their palm, then someone else. A rhythm, a slap, a slap, a slap, all together. 187 palms slapping knees, like a heart, one huge heart. Dan sat in the corner, turned away toward the wall. Engineers don't cry. It's just walls and roofs and supplies, physics, logistics, nothing special. Spring brought a new task. A city. Not a village. A city. Dan had been thinking about it all winter, sketching on his tablet, calculating, recalculating. The settlement stood by a cave beneath a cliff. A good spot for 30 people. Cramped for 200. Impossible for 500. A new site was needed. He found it 300 steps from the settlement. A hill, gentle, with a flat top. The river curved around it on 2 sides, creating natural protection from 3 directions. The 4th side opened onto a meadow, an open space with a clear view. Dan climbed the hill and stood there for an hour. He turned this way and that. He looked around. He calculated the angles. He assessed the terrain. He figured out where the wall would go, where the gates would stand, where the main street would run. He saw the city, not yet built, not yet in existence, but already alive in his mind. 2 walls, an outer wall and an inner wall. A moat in front of the outer wall. Gates to the west. A drawbridge across the moat. Straight streets. Neighborhoods. The central square. The Temple of Mora. Workshops. A granary. Sewers. Bathhouses. Everything. All the experience he carried in his mind. Everything humanity had built over 12,000 years. Condensed into a single sketch on a single hill. He went down and called everyone. Mora, Brana, Kairu, Hana, Una. He led them up the hill. With a stick, he drew a large rectangle on the ground. Here's the wall, inside the lines. Here are the streets, squares. Here are the houses, a circle in the center. Here's the square. People watched, silently, for a long time. Bran was the first to ask how many people were needed. Dan replied, "Everyone, and just as many more." Una said she would bring people from the south. Her father would send workers in exchange for pots, salt, and safety. Hannah said she would keep track of every stone. Kyra said that while they were building, she would stand guard. Mora said nothing. She placed her hand on the ground of the hill. She closed her eyes. Then she opened them and looked at Dan. The earth agrees. Dan nodded. The earth agrees. We can begin. Construction began on the first day of summer. 500 people. Where did 500 come from? Una brought 100 from her father. 2 more small tribes arrived. 30 people from there, 20 from there. Word of mouth worked better than any advertisement. A place where people don't die in winter. A place behind the wall. A place where the builder creates warmth from stones. Dan divided up the work. Masons on the wall, diggers on the moat, carpenters on the roofs, potters on the bricks. Yes, bricks. The first in the world. Clay molded into uniform blocks and dried in the sun. Unfired. Firing requires a kiln, which doesn't exist yet. But unfired bricks made of clay and rubble can bear the weight. Dan knew that. Jericho had stood on unfired bricks for 10,000 years. The wall was growing, faster than the first one, because people already knew how, because there were many of them, because everyone could see the purpose. Not some abstract future, a concrete one. My house will be inside this wall. My children will sleep behind it. Dan stood on the hill and watched as hundreds of people carried stones, a human chain stretching from the cliff to the hill, stone by stone, row by row, day by day. Mora consecrated the first foundation stone. She placed it in the ground. She spoke words that Dan didn't fully understand. Something about the spirits that hold the earth. Something about children who haven't been born yet. Something about the builder who came out of the fog. Dan stood nearby and said nothing. He thought about how this stone would still be here when his bones had turned to dust. How this city would outlive him by thousands of years. How someday someone would dig up this foundation and wonder, where from? How? Who? And find no answer. Because Dan wouldn't leave any records. Hannah would leave the records, in her language, with her symbols. His name would sound like a whisper in a myth. The builder. The one who came out of the fog. The city grew faster than Dan had anticipated. The outer wall was completed in 4 months, 4 human heights high, 3 stones thick at the bottom and 2 at the top. A moat in front of it, chest deep and 4 paces wide. The gate was on the west side. Dan built it from logs bound with sinew and reinforced with stone pillars. A drawbridge spanned the moat, a very simple design. 2 logs suspended by ropes. Pull the ropes and the bridge goes up. Let go and the bridge comes down. Bran checked it himself. He stood on the bridge. He hopped around a bit. The bridge held. Bran nodded. The inner wall ran around the citadel at the top of the hill. It was lower than the outer wall, but thicker. The last line of defense. If the enemy breached the outer wall, they'd encounter the second one. And beyond the second wall lay the square. And in the square were the people who needed protecting. Dan was sketching and building at the same time. Streets, straight, intersecting at right angles. Neighborhoods, each housing 4 to 6 families. Houses made of stone and adobe. Roofs of poles and clay. Chimneys, floors. Not all had Ondal heating. There weren't enough hands to do them all. But every house was dry and warm. Sewer system. Dan had been thinking about it from day one. Stone gutters beneath the streets, sloping from the center toward the river. Rainwater and waste flow down and out through an opening in the wall. Simple, rough, but it works. Without it, 500 people in such a cramped space would have suffocated from disease in a single winter. Dan knew this better than anyone. He'd seen what happens to cities without a sewer system. In his time, it was something out of a history textbook. Here, it would have meant death. Nia appeared in the midst of construction. A Kyra patrol found her 3 days' journey to the north. A ransacked camp. Bodies. The stench. And in the midst of it all, a girl. 12 years old. She was sitting on a rock, staring straight ahead. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. She was silent. Kyra carried her in her arms. The girl was as light as an empty pot. Mora examined her. No wounds. Hunger, yes. Shock, yes. But most importantly, she didn't speak. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She had seen her family being killed, and she hadn't made a sound since. Dan gave her food, water, a place, a warm one, by the stove in Lena's workshop. Nia sat and watched Lena mold pots. 1 day, 2, 3. On the 4th day, she picked up a splinter and began drawing on the floor. Lines, angles, rectangles. Dan noticed it on the 5th day. He walked into the workshop and saw the drawing on the clay floor. A floor plan. A top-down view. 4 walls, a door, a window, a chimney. Inside, a partition dividing the space into 2 rooms. The proportions were correct. The angles were right. The scale was accurate. Dan crouched down and looked at the drawing, then at Nia. She was sitting in the corner, looking at him. A 12-year-old girl who had never seen a blueprint and didn't know what scale was, had drawn a floor plan of a house that Dan recognized. It was Mora's house, with an ondol, a bird's-eye view. Nia had seen it once, when they'd led her past it. One glance, and she'd recreated it from memory, with the correct proportions. Dan took his multi-tool out of his pocket. He pulled out a small metal ruler. He placed it next to Nia. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, held it against the floor, drew a line along the edge, even, straight. She looked at Dan. He took out his tablet, opened the blueprint of the first city, turned the screen toward Nia. She looked at it, for a long time. She ran her finger along the lines of the walls, across the squares of the blocks, around the circle of the plaza. Then she picked up a splinter and began to copy it, on the floor, from memory, detail by detail. Dan watched and felt his throat tighten. He had found her, his heir. Not a son, not a student, an architect. Someone who sees buildings just as he does, who thinks in lines and angles and proportions, who doesn't need to be told what a load-bearing wall is because she feels it. He made a table for her, a small one, to fit her height, out of flat stone on 4 legs. He placed a clay tablet on it, next to it a sharpened stick, and a homemade compass made of 2 splinters tied together with sinew. Nia sat down at the table. She drew the first line, then the second. Dan stood nearby and said she didn't have to speak. She would draw, and what she drew would stand for 1,000 years. Nia looked at him, and for the first time ever, something other than emptiness appeared in her eyes, something alive. She didn't smile, not yet, but she nodded and returned to her drawing. Hagrin arrived at the end of the 2nd year, 1,000 warriors, 7 tribes united under his command. Dan saw them from the watchtower at dawn, a dark mass at the edge of the forest. Spears jutted out like the teeth of a comb. Smoke rose above them from dozens of bonfires. They had come and made no attempt to hide. Dan went down, calmly, slowly. He had been preparing for this for 2 years. Every stone in the wall, every meter of the moat, every embrasure, all for this day. He gathered everyone, Bran, Kyra, Mora, Hannah, Una, the 5 commanders of the 5 defense sectors. Dan spread a map out on the table, a clay tablet showing the city and its surroundings. Marked on it were all the firing sectors, all the supplies, all the reserves. He spoke briefly, 1 order for each commander. Bran at the gates, 40 spearmen, hold the passage, do not go out. Kyra on the southern wall, 20 archers, fire from 200 paces, no closer than 100. Fall back to the second wall if they break through. The other 3 commanders in the east and north. Mora is inside, with the children, with the elderly, with the wounded. Kana is writing down the orders on tablets and sending them via runners. Una is in the watchtower next to Dan, relaying signals, coordinating. Dan looked at everyone. He said the walls would hold. He built them for this very purpose. Every stone was laid to withstand an assault. Each row is connected to the next. A wall isn't just a pile of stones. A wall is a living creature that anchors itself to the ground and won't let anything through. Everyone dispersed. Hagrin approached the wall on the 2nd day. Dan saw him from the watchtower, 2 meters tall, broad-shouldered. His left arm was black and charred. He stood in front of the gate and looked up. Then he shouted. His voice sounded like stone striking stone. Dan didn't catch all the words. Una translated. Hagrin demanded that they hand over the pale stranger, alive. Then he would leave. If not, he would burn everything and everyone. Dan replied through Una, "No." Hagrin stood there staring at the wall. Then he turned and walked back to his men. The assault began on the third day. At dawn, 600 warriors charged the wall from 3 sides at once. With ladders made of logs, with ropes, with stones they hurled upward to knock down the defenders. Kyra opened fire from 200 paces away. The arrows from her new bow flew far and true. The first ranks of attackers fell before they could reach the moat. But there were too many of them. They climbed over the bodies and rushed into the moat, and got stuck. The escarpment. A vertical wall on the side of the rampart. You can climb down. It's hard to climb back up. And while you're climbing, stones rain down from above and boiling water pours down. Dan stood on the watchtower with his tablet. The map before his eyes. Sectors, supplies, reserves. He saw everything. The southern wall was under pressure. Transfer 10 spearmen from the north. The boiling water in the west is running out. Send the kids to the campfires to heat water. Arrows in the eastern sector are running low. Reallocate from the south. He wasn't fighting. He was directing. The assault had rolled back by noon. Hagrin lost 100 men. The wall stood. Not a single breach. Not a single breakthrough. Dan climbed down from the watchtower on wobbly legs. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. He had killed people today. Not with his hands. With orders. A stone here. Boiling water there. An arrow at that man. He had killed and knew he would kill more because Hagrin wouldn't stop. The siege lasted 40 days. Hagrin changed his tactics. He stormed at night. He tried to set the gates on fire. He dug tunnels under the wall. Every time Dan found a way to counter it. The gates were coated with wet clay and wouldn't burn. The tunnel collapsed because Dan had weakened the soil at the likely entry points in advance. The nighttime assault was met with torches and arrows. On the 20th day, Bran was wounded. A stone hit his shoulder. The bone wasn't broken, but his arm wouldn't work. Bran sat by the wall, cursing. Dan came over to him. Bran looked at him and said one sentence. "Maybe you're not completely useless." Then he pulled a tooth from his bosom, a wolf's tooth, from the gray wolf he'd killed in their first skirmish a year ago. He placed it next to Dan. He stood up and walked back to the wall, with one hand. On the 30th day, Hagrin abandoned everyone. The final assault. 800 warriors, from all sides, all at once. The wall shook from the blows. Log battering rams pounded against the gates. Ladders were set up one after another. Kyra shot without ceasing. Her hands were bloodied from the bowstring. Her eyes were dry. Her face was stony. On the southern section, the enemy scaled the wall. 20 warriors were inside. Bran met them with his spearmen. They fought in the streets. Dan saw it from the watchtower. He saw how Bran, with his one good arm, drove a spear into the gray wolf's chest. How he fell and got back up. How he fell again. Dan gave the order he'd been preparing for 2 years, to bring down the eastern section onto them. The eastern wall had been a trap from the very beginning. Dan had built weak spots into it, stones held in place by a single pin. Pull out the pin, and the section falls, outward, onto those standing beneath it. 3 men pulled out 3 pins. The 20-step-long section collapsed forward. Tons of stone rained down on the attackers. A roar, dust, screams. When the dust settled, dozens of bodies lay at the foot of the wall. The attack had stalled. The survivors fled. Hagrin did not run. He stood before the gate, alone. His men ran past him, but he remained standing. Then he walked toward the wall, slowly, with difficulty. He was wounded. Blood streamed down his face. His left arm hung limply. He reached the gate, fell to his knees, then onto his side. He lay in the mud by the stone threshold, breathing. Dan climbed down from the watchtower. He walked through the gate. He stood over Hagrin. Hagrin looked up at him from below. His eyes were cloudy. He whispered that Dan wasn't human, that he was a spirit. Dan leaned down and replied quietly, "No, I'm just an engineer." Hagrin closed his eyes and never opened them again. The morning after the siege was quiet. No screams, no blows, no rumbling of stones. Only the wind and the river and the birds, who cared nothing for people and their wars. Dan stood on the wall and looked out over the valley. The bodies had been cleared away at dawn. The gray wolves were buried across the river. Their own were buried in the clearing by the cliff. 11 little mounds. 11 names that Kana had written on a clay tablet. Dan knew each one. He repeated each one to himself. He had built the wall so that no one would die. 11 people had died for her. He stood there looking at the mounds, not knowing how to live with this. Mora approached. She stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said that in the past, after a battle like this, everyone would have died. All 187 of them. The children, the elderly, everyone. Dan nodded. He knew, but knowing didn't help. Mora took his hand, for the first time, in front of everyone. Her palm was dry and warm and calloused from work. She clasped his fingers and didn't let go. Dan stood there, holding her hand and looking out at the valley, not moving. The city stood. Its walls were chipped. The eastern section was destroyed. The gates were mangled. But the city stood. And inside it, 176 people were alive. Alive because 2 years ago, a skinny, pale stranger had driven 8 willow twigs into the ground in front of the cave's entrance. 3 days later, the first envoys arrived at the gates. From the east, a small tribe Dan had never heard of. They had seen the gray wolves running. They had seen the bodies. They had seen the wall still standing. And they had not come to fight. They had come to talk. Una went out to meet them, in new clothes, wearing beads, with her back straight and her eyes sharp. She spoke for 2 hours. Dan didn't interfere. This was her home, the house of negotiations. The envoys left and returned a week later with gifts, hides, flint, and dried meat, and a request. They wanted to live nearby, under the protection of the wall. Dan said yes. Then others came, from the south, from the north, tribes that even the oldest of the river people had never heard of. They flowed toward the city like water toward a lowland. Because the city was the only place in the world where winter didn't kill, where the walls kept the enemy out, where food was stored in pots and grain grew from the earth. Una welcomed everyone. She recorded the terms. Kana inscribed them on tablets. Lena made pots for the new families. Kyra expanded the patrols. Bran trained the new warriors. Everyone did their part. Everyone knew their place. The system worked. Dan stood on the hill and watched as a new settlement grew at the foot of the wall. Houses beyond the wall. He needed a second outer wall, wider, longer. The city was growing and showed no signs of stopping. He began sketching a new plan. Naya sat next to him at her small table, sketching as well. Her lines were straighter than Dan's. Her angles were more precise. She was drawing a house that didn't yet exist, with 2 stories, with a courtyard, with a staircase. Dan looked at the drawing and saw ideas in it that he hadn't suggested. Naya had come up with them on her own. A second story that jutted out over the first, a shadow below, coolness in the summer, protection from the rain. Dan looked at it and felt something ease in his chest. He didn't need to be eternal. Naya would carry on. She was already carrying on. That evening, Dan sat by the campfire in the square. Everyone was around him. Mora sat next to him, shoulder to shoulder, her hand on his knee. Kyra sat across from him, her bow behind her back. She looked at Dan, and in her eyes was something she didn't put into words. Lena sat a little further away, twirling a small pot between her fingers. Inside lay a wild strawberry, the first of the year. She held the pot out to Dan, silently. Hannah sat by the fire and wrote. Her fingers moved across the wet clay with practiced, precise movements.